On a freezing morning in Moscow, soldiers marched across Red Square, not for celebration, but because the enemy was close enough that some people swore they could hear the front line. The Nazis had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. The capital was panicking. Government offices were packing. Trains were being prepared. And one question cut through everything. Would Stalin run or would he stay? Because in that moment, when the Germans were at the gates of Moscow, what Stalin said mattered, but what he did next mattered even more.
By October 1941, Germany launched Operation Typhoon, the drive to take Moscow. This wasn't just another city. Moscow was the Soviet Union's command center, rail hub, symbolic heart. And the Germans came frighteningly close. At one point in late November, German units were reported less than 35 kilometers from the Kremlin, and in the northwest they reached areas only a few dozen kilometers away, close enough that the idea of the gates didn't feel metaphorical anymore. Inside the city, people were asking a dangerous question, sometimes out loud. Is this the end?
Now here's the part many later histories tried to soften. For a moment, the Soviet leadership did prepare to leave. A State Defense Committee document dated October 15, 1941 recorded a decision to evacuate top government institutions, and even mentioned that Stalin would leave tomorrow or later, depending on the situation. Equipment was packed. Communications were moved. Stalin's train was prepared. On the night of October 16th, key personnel were told to get ready to flee. And Moscow cracked. Rumors flew, shops were looted, roads jammed with people trying to escape. If the leader fled, many believed the city would psychologically fall before it fell militarily.
To understand Stalin in October 1941, you have to remember June 1941. When Hitler invaded, Stalin, who had been warned repeatedly, was stunned. Some accounts describe him collapsing into despair at his dacha. One version of what he told his inner circle is famously crude, that Lenin left a great inheritance and Stalin's generation had ruined it. Whether every word is perfectly preserved or not, the meaning is clear. For a moment, Stalin believed he might have doomed the country. And dictators don't fear enemies the way normal people do. They fear loss of control. By October, that fear returned. Only now the danger wasn't just defeat. It was Moscow. So Stalin faced the simplest, most terrifying choice of his life. Stay in Moscow, risk encirclement, capture, assassination, or leave, save himself, but maybe collapse the nation's will. According to later recollections and interviews cited in historical accounts, Stalin held a meeting where he pressed his circle with a blunt question: are we going to defend Moscow? One by one, they answered yes, because in Stalin's system, the wrong answer could be fatal. And then, Stalin made the choice that became legend. He stayed. The train was unpacked, offices reopened. The message to the city was simple: if Moscow falls, Stalin falls with it.
Around this time, Stalin leaned heavily on commanders like Georgy Zhukov. One widely repeated account describes Stalin asking Zhukov whether Moscow could be held and ordering him to speak honestly. Zhukov said it was possible, but reserves were urgently needed. This is where Stalin's words weren't poetic. They were transactional. Can we hold? What do you need? How many divisions? Where is the line? It wasn't inspiring, but it was leadership in a crisis. And while Moscow dug trenches, factories converted to war production, and civilians prepared for siege, the front line bled.
By late November, German spearheads reached some of the closest points of the campaign. Accounts describe German units near the Moscow-Volga Canal and within a few dozen kilometers of the Kremlin. But the Germans were exhausted. Supply lines were stretched, winter gear was insufficient, and Soviet resistance, backed by fresh reserves, stiffened. This wasn't a clean, they reached the wall of the Kremlin moment. It was worse. It was a grinding approach where Moscow could feel the war breathing down its neck. And then Stalin did something that, on paper, sounded insane. On November 7th, 1941, Stalin appeared in public at the Red Square Parade, a propaganda gamble during a real battle. Some of the troops marching would go straight from the parade into combat. When the Nazis were close enough that the capital could hear the war, Stalin chose to speak not only with orders, but with symbolism. In that speech, Stalin framed the war as a liberating mission, not just survival. He invoked Russian historical heroes Nevsky, Minin, Pozharsky, Suvorov, Kutuzov, calling on their images to inspire the fight. And he ended with a line built to be repeated everywhere. Under the banner of Lenin, forward to victory. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a signal flare to the entire Soviet system. The leader is here, the capital is still functioning, the war is not lost, and anyone who spreads panic is now opposing history itself. Even accounts discussing Stalin's earlier despair note how dramatic the contrast was from dacha silence to public defiance in the snow. So, what did Stalin say when the Nazis reached the gates of Moscow? He said, "Moscow stands, the war is just, and the country will fight to the end."
A speech doesn't stop tanks, but speeches can stop collapse. Morale is a weapon, especially in a state built on fear and command. Not long after, the Soviets launched counteroffensives that pushed the Germans back from Moscow, turning the failure to take the capital into a major psychological break in Operation Barbarossa's momentum. And later, Stalin would issue messages framing the war in broader moral terms, like arguing it was absurd to equate Hitler's clique with the entire German people, saying in 1942 that Hitlers come and go, while states and peoples remain. That line wasn't spoken at the gates in 1941, but it shows how Stalin's messaging evolved once Moscow survived.
History loves a single quote, one perfect sentence frozen in time. But the truth is more powerful. When the Nazis reached the gates of Moscow, Stalin didn't win the moment with one clever line. He won it by choosing not to run, forcing his circle to commit, and then stepping onto Red Square to broadcast a message of defiance to an entire collapsing nation. He said Moscow would be defended, and then he proved it by staying. Because in wars like this, the most important words aren't always the ones spoken into microphones. Sometimes the most important words are the ones a leader speaks with their feet by refusing to leave.